Thank you, everybody. Thank you for mentioning the conference. It's very exciting. We're going to have people from all over the world. And I'm very excited that I'm actually started collaborating with a marvelous researcher, Dr. Charlotte Skoglund Borg from Sweden, who is a researcher on women with ADHD. And not surprisingly, it turns out all the research had been done on prepubescent boys. So it's a whole new field to discover that hormones affect women with ADHD and how that happens. And we're going to be working together and talking about the overlap between autism and ADHD. So I'm very excited to be doing that. But meanwhile, back at the ranch, back to school, right? It's September, it's after Labor Day, and our kids are back in school. And so we are, as you said, trying to be part of the school team. And this is kind of what we don't want. I'm trying to get this to go forward.
School is the one thing that, though I don't dream very often, if I have some sort of reoccurring nightmare, it is likely to be about school. And unfortunately, a lot of autistic and neurodivergent people share these similar sentiments about education.
That is Lyric Rivera, and also known as Neurodivergent Rebel. Lyric has ADHD as well as autism and had the experience in school of having a teacher tie her to her chair because she was too waily. So when she says she has nightmares, that's really true. And for many of your, let me, before I go on, how many people in the audience are parents? Can you put that in the chat and give our hosts some idea? And how many are education professionals? And other kinds of professionals? Who else would we have, guys?
So we have at least, it looks like a lot of parents. We have plus we have a parent and a school social worker. We have a parent and a coach, another parent and a coach.
Great.
So
great, multiple hats.
Yes.
So I just wanted to make sure this is relevant for everybody. So I'm starting out with neurodiversity because we're talking about ADHD, but really ADHD is a form of neurodiversity. And so what do I mean? Well, that means that our brains don't work quite the way is expected. That's called typical, as if there was only one thing that was typical, which is, of course, kind of silly. It's a different way of processing and responding to the world. And one thing which I think is a mistaken perception is that it's all negative. It's all, I mean, when you think about the way things are defined, they're all defined as pathology. And I have a friend who's a neuropsychologist who is editing this big book on ADHD. And I looked at it and I said, well, Jeanette, where's the part on creativity? Where's the part on how creative these kids are? She said, well, that's not one of the things that got studied. And so the emphasis is on pathology when in fact the creativity, the kind of the kind of energy that our ADHD kids bring to the world it's a superpower. And we want to make sure that's recognized too. So who's neurodivergent? Well, a lot of kids, a lot of people. And when you think about this whole idea of divergence, we really take divergences as normal. I mean, we come in all different colors. We don't say a white person is a broken Black person. We're all different colors. We're different sizes. There are people who are little teeny Olympic gymnasts and guys who are 7-foot NBA centers. We come in different talents. My daughter was an opera singer. My granddaughter can't carry a tune, but she's super athletic, and God knows she didn't get that from me. So we have all of this kind of diversity, and yet when it comes to the way we process things, the way our brains work, all of a sudden we're all supposed to do it the same way. And the fact is we don't do it all the same way. And that brings a richness to what we have available to us, but sometimes it's not looked at that way.
Marcia,
Yes.
I'm going to interrupt you for a second because I don't think one of the things we did not say at the beginning was that if anyone has a question, please put your questions in the chat. If there's something that's terribly unclear, we'll let Marcia know. Otherwise, we're going to try to save it until the end so that the flow of the talk doesn't disorganize anyone.
Right. Or
Okay.
me.
Or you.
Or me.
Okay.
So there's what I was talking about was neurodiversity and how we take diversity for granted. And if every tree was a maple tree, it'd be pretty boring. And if every person was the same, anybody ever seen that movie Barbie? If
Yes.
everybody was a Barbie doll and everybody was a Ken doll, it would be a very boring world. So our brains work differently, and that's part of the richness. And each time something different works to advance this, so you'll have to just bear with me. No, that's taking me the wrong way. Okay. All right. So what are some common misunderstandings? Well, the first is that neurodivergent kids are choosing to be difficult. Oh, excuse me. I'm sorry. I have ADHD. I'm on the spectrum. I have dyslexia. The guy who used to be governor of Connecticut was dyslexic, and they thought that no one understood he was dyslexic because he orally was very, very proficient. And so they said he'd never amount to anything. He became a lawyer and governor of Connecticut. So, but the idea is that these children are choosing to be this way. And so you'll see on an IEP, this child will sit still, this child will pay attention, this child will, do the following things, and okay, he'll just stop choosing to have ADHD, right? The idea that neurodivergent behavior is non-functional, that there's no reason. Well, there are some kids who have to move to listen, or they have to jiggle to listen. And if they're not, they're so focused on holding still, they can't engage in learning and they can't pay attention. So I had one little boy I used to see, and he'd be going back and forth on a hoverboard while we were having our session, because that's what worked best for him. The idea that neurodivergent children can just turn off their actions, just stop acting this way and you'll be fine. Well, that doesn't work, does it? It doesn't work for anyone I've ever seen. And that neurodivergent behavior is only triggered by right now. And we all know that sometimes our kids had a bad night's sleep. Sometimes they're hungry. Sometimes something went on yesterday that's still bothering them. And so the whole emphasis of this talk is, which I'm hoping I get to, trying to figure out what's going to advance it, is that understanding is the key to this. Understanding what's going on, not using a diagnosis as an explanation. And so I have this up just because, number one, there are so many kids, our children are not alone, that more boys are diagnosed than girls, but often girls are missed. Why? Because we have a stereotype of what ADHD looks like, and girls who are inattentive often don't get picked up until they're about 10 to 14, or they don't get picked up at all. They're just thought to be too social or not motivated or not interested enough. And so they are misunderstood, and I think that one of the things I want to stress is that being neurodivergent and being misunderstood is damaging. It is damaging to our kids to be treated in a way that does not respect their experience, does not validate their experience. And so that's one reason why I harp on the idea of understanding. it's interesting that according to the CDC, half of these children have a behavior or conduct problem. Well, I may be prejudiced, but I think what that means is they have ADHD or they have something that makes them behave in a way that's not conforming to what everybody wants, and that's not a ODD or a conduct problem. That's being who they authentically are. And maybe we have to learn how to, include children whose needs in terms of listening, participating, behavior look different. And 4 in 10 have anxiety. Well, that might have something to do with how they're being responded to, because if you got so much negative feedback and, so many corrections, you expect it to have anxiety. And anxiety increases as they get older. I thought this was really interesting that as they get older, they get more anxious. And that, I'm sure many of you are familiar with the concept of masking. We talk about it a lot with autism, but it's true for kids with ADHD too. They're trying to fit in and they don't want to look as anxious as they are. So they do their best to hide it and just sort of look like they're cool, right? We all want to be cool. But the fact is, there's probably a whole lot more anxiety than we're seeing right there. And notice that girls are more anxious than boys, probably because they're being missed, but also we have stereotypic gender expectations of girls still, that girls are going to be people pleasers and girls are going to do what they're told and be submissive and not. And so I think it's more difficult as a girl to be neurodivergent because you're not being the stereotype of what we expect of girls. So take a look at this chart. Okay. I think it's safe to say that it's in just about every kindergarten or early childhood classroom. And does this really work for our kids as a model of who they should be? I actually had parents come to me and they thought their child needed medication for ADHD. They wanted me to diagnose the child so they could get medication. And the problem was that the child wasn't sitting still during circle time. The children were all supposed to sit in a circle and listen. And this little boy was 5. And I'm like, are you kidding me? His problem is that he's 5 and he doesn't want to sit in a circle, and that's okay. Developmentally, he doesn't have to be ready to sit in a circle. But, this idea of pathologizing things is so ingrained. But, not everybody is going to be able to hold still, have a still body, listen in the way that they're thinking of listening. And that doesn't mean that they're doing it wrong. It means that they're doing it in a way that works for them. And now that half the world has fidget toys, I think maybe that's a little bit more. They're all sitting there with those little spinny things. But I think that the idea that different people listen, learn, participate differently has to be something that we get understood. So when I talk about neurodivergent, what I try to do is to say it's not that we're bad or defective, we're different. And so I do a lot of diagnosing women who are diagnosed with ADHD and autism. And what I say is, there's Dell computers and there are Macs, and they're both good computers. But if you're a Mac, you just don't run this, you don't have the same operating system. And so if you have a different operating system, you're still fine, but it doesn't work the same. You might not run the same program, so it might not run as well. And so we need to understand ourselves. We need to accept ourselves. We need to be understood so that we can value ourselves, whether we're a Dell or a Mac. So now I'm getting to the point of what we were here for, which is being an advocate and an effective advocate for our children. And so there are 3 critical things that I'm going to try to focus on. One is understanding. Understanding our children, understanding what their experience is from their perspective, not from the perspective of others who have expectations of them. Then the question of communication, how do we communicate? And then last but not least, just follow up. because too often we make a great effort to communicate, we have a meeting, and then it all kind of disappears until the end of the semester, and we never knew what happened. So understanding. We need to understand their emotions. We need to understand their behavior, their social skills, their sensory issues, their triggers, and most of all, we need to understand their strengths. You know, because we can engage kids through their strengths. And so there are so many kids that I've worked with where understanding that this boy gets frustrated when he can't get a math problem, okay? And he's pretty easily frustrated, but when he gets frustrated, he gets down on himself and he gets angry at himself. And then he would start hitting himself. And the more he got corrected, the more frustrated he got. And then he was perceived as a behavior problem because he was so frustrated that he would finally get up and run away. So it was so, once we were able to say, look, what we need to do is deal with that frustration at the beginning and understand this kid is just being so hard on himself. And what worked was an OT came up with, he would go out in the hall and do wall push-ups and have the validation for the teacher that this was a really hard math problem. He didn't have to be so down on himself. And, kind of understand where he was coming from. And then he wasn't a behavior problem anymore. He had the tools he needed and the validation he needed to be able to calm back down and do well. So we want to understand social skills. There are some children all want to be included, no matter what kind of neurodivergent they are. They all want to be included. And if our children are perceived as being a little bit different or a little bit quirky, or sometimes they can struggle to figure out how to fit in. And so a child might, for example, think that being funny is the best way to fit in. And rather than if instead of just having the child corrected, this is not an appropriate time kind of thing, but instead to be able to have the child have better ways of being included. And when we can facilitate, we coach out there. Hi, coach. A coach can be so helpful in bringing in a child and helping that child feel included. And if the child, for example, is having trouble sustaining their attention during a game, how do we help them rather than criticize them? How do we help them have it and be engaged? I had one little boy who was he was absolutely not going to learn anything about this periodic table because it was just really boring and he just had no interest. But when it was made into a game that was you buy the electrons and protons were photon and electron torpedoes, and based on which element he chose, he had that many torpedoes to work with. Well, he was a competitive little soul, and he learned that periodic table pretty quickly because he wanted to have the most effective fighting force in the world. So, the more we understand and the more creative we can be, the more we can really engage our kids and engage them to be successful. I keep trying to find what works. There we go. And so to me, and what I always tell the people I work with, the least useful word in the English language, and it's probably true in other languages, is should. A 12-year-old should be able to do X. Okay. And there's absolutely no point in that. All it does is make the parent feel bad as a parent and the child feel bad as a child. We need to understand who our children are right now. And I can use an example from my own family. I was at a wedding this weekend, which happened to be my daughter's. So yay. And in Cancun. And there was a cousin who had a little girl who did have ADHD. She still does have ADHD. And it was somewhat painful for a long time because she would insist that French children could sit still and have dinner and at a very lovely restaurant and this girl was just wiggly and squiggly and couldn't sit still. And her mother was always so aggravated with her. And of course I couldn't say anything. because, you know, it wasn't my business. But I was so happy to see at the wedding that the wedding was outdoors. If you're going to be in Cancun, you're going to do this on the beach. And this kid could run around to her heart's content. And her mother was more than pleased and said, you know what? This is where she's happy. And this is how she can be here. And she could get up and she could sit down and it was fine. And so she finally was able to get past the shoulds of what her daughter should be doing and just to accept this is who my daughter is, this is what works for her. And actually, she's a great kid. So to say a 12-year-old should, a 10-year-old should, a 5-year-old should, you know, kind of that when we're hearing about shoulds. What we need to do is understand what's happening from the child's perspective. And that is a kind of paradigm shift because so often the paradigm from the point of view of a classroom is what the child should, back to that should, what the child should be doing. And, you know, so from this perspective, you, the child's behavior is often seen as attention seeking, okay, or the child's behavior is seen as avoidant, or we all know the list of what children's behaviors are seen as, but from a child's perspective, that might be totally irrelevant. They're not necessarily looking for attention. They're more looking to be able to move because their bodies need to move. And that's the attention isn't their perspective. So we need to understand from their perspective what's going on and to be able to accept that ourselves, as this mother that I'm describing did, to accept our children that, you know, this is a child who needs to move, or this is a child who needs to do whatever it is that she does or he does or they do to be themselves. But sometimes when you're a child, the problems just seem huge. They seem insurmountable. And that's especially when they need our support because we're the ones who understand them best. And we're the ones who can validate them and say, yeah, I know, I understand it's really, really hard. And help them have the resources, the coping strategies to be able to hang in there. One thing I always tell the kids that I work with is being in school is the hardest time you're going to go through in your life because it's the only time when you're going to have to act like everybody else and be good at everything. Once you graduate school, you can pick doing something that you like, and you can pick, you know, being somewhere that's a good fit for you. But right now is, you know, your job throughout this school is to keep your head on straight. And as long as we can keep your head screwed on straight, we, you know, to me, we're doing well. And the times that feel like that, we want to help them get through. Because neurodivergent kids often, I showed you anxiety before, they're also often depressed. Again, because they're getting a lot of negative feedback about who they are when they're being their authentic selves. And we need them to be able to have self-compassion and to love themselves, like themselves as we love them and like them. And we need to share that with the staff at school as well. So with all of this talk about understanding, the bottom line is that she, they have ADHD is not an explanation for what is going on. The explanation is it's way too hot in this room and this child is sensitive to temperature, or this child is sensitive to noise, or this child got overstimulated out on the playground and is having trouble making a transition back into the classroom. That's what understanding is, okay? Not a label. Not a, well, it's all explained by ADHD. If we're going to be helpful, if we're going to help a child transition, for example, we have to understand what's going on. And if a child gets too revved up by running around playing tag, then how do we help, you know, how do we help all the children calm down? Maybe everybody can do some stretching exercises when they come in from recess. And that helps children make that transition. So that's why this understanding is so important. And it's not just true for our kids. What helps our kids can help all kids. All the kids could probably benefit. And so I know some wonderful classrooms where the teachers do that. And everybody has some stretching, or everybody has something that helps make them transition. So we have all this wonderful understanding, but now what we want to do is communicate it. And I think the first thing we need to do is to understand and appreciate the perspective of teachers, because I think too often, even though federal, as someone mentioned earlier when we were all talking, that federal law requires that parents and teachers are a team, in fact, it can feel adversarial. And ideally, that's not what we want. We actually want to be a team. And teachers have trained as school professionals to be in the position they're in, and they really deserve the respect and to be treated that way as the professionals they are. However, what they need is our understanding, that our the for us to be able to help them help our children. And so if we come in saying, well, you should remember that word should, you should have already figured my child out. You should already have been doing this. You should already have been doing that. A teacher is a human being, and anybody who's is going to get defensive. Whereas if we come in and we have the attitude that I appreciate your professionalism and I know you want my child to be successful as much as I do, and so let's figure this out together, then that engages everybody in a collaborative process. Does that make sense to everyone? So we go in with the right attitude. And so how do we communicate best? I have parents who come in and they have like a say 3, 4, 5, 6 single page explanation of everything about their child. And I hate to say this, but when when a teacher has 35 kids, they don't have time to read all of that, or they may not be able to absorb all of that. What we need to be is clear, and we need to have some brevity. We need to be to the point. So when we come into a meeting, we want to not just be telling stories of, about all the things that happened at home, but we want to be able to say, my concern is this. Johnny comes home and he, doesn't understand what he's supposed to do, or he might comes home and he feels that he's somehow not, I mean, my granddaughter came home and she felt like she was failing first grade because it turned out was dyslexic. And so if the child is having an issue and is coming home and we're hearing about it, or we see the child melts down when they get home, we want to be able to frame that as a concern that is specific and clear, because what we want to do is engage in this problem solving process together. And so as I can tell you that my daughter had issues when she went to school. And and believe it or not, even when I was a parent in a team meeting, it was very intimidating. And if you don't speak the language, then it's really difficult to know what people are saying they're going to do. So if you're going to be a member of the team, you've got to understand what people are saying. And that simply means ask for clarification. If this is what's being suggested, well, what exactly does that mean? Who's going to do it? When is it going to get done? Well, what does that term mean? If this is your idea of what to do, what exactly does that mean? And because to be to be fully a team member, we have to really understand and participate, and to be able to say, well, that does make sense to me, or you know what, we actually tried something very much like that at home and it wasn't that effective. you know this was more effective, because once we know what they're talking about, then we can say, aha, well, here's how it feels, here's the experience we have that's relevant to it, and which we frame not as right and wrong, but what is and isn't working. So we've tried helping by doing this, and that doesn't seem to be working in the way that we intended it to. So I think that, again, it's a kind of non-defensive way of framing things. Um, it's I often we have plans that we make, we'll cut down the number of homework. I think the next person's coming is talking about homework, and that's really terrific. One of the things that I often experience is that children try so hard to hold it together all day that by the time they come home, they are fried. They've just had it. They've been trying to hold still, be good, listen, do what's expected of them, stay, with attending to what they're supposed to be attending to. And they come home and that's it. And then we're saying, okay, now do some more work. And that might also be the time if they're taking ADHD medication that the medication's wearing off. And so understanding all of that and saying, okay, then well, what's realistic? What's going to work for this child? Maybe there's a time during the school day when the child can do some of this work. So I think that again, it's a question of understanding and what's going to work. And we might say, even though we reduced how much homework there is, my child comes home so fried, that's more than is manageable. And if there's one thing that I really think doesn't work, it's when parents have to become homework police. I'm not trying to anticipate the next talk, but when all you're doing is saying, what is your homework? Show me your homework. Have you started your math? How much of your math have you gotten done? Let me see your math. Did you get to your history? You are the homework police, and that's not who you want to be. You want to be mom. You want to be dad. You want to be the person who is supportive, and this is the apple of your eye. You don't want to be the nag of all time, right? So, so what we're trying to do is keep parents out of the role of homework police. We can be homework scaffolders, but we don't want to have to be bad cops about this. If we're in a situation where that's what's happening, then we have to go back to this drawing board and say, okay, this isn't working. How can we make this work better? And always set up the next meeting when you're at a meeting so that we've come up with some ideas, we've come up with, maybe some ways of framing what's going on, maybe some ways of understanding what's going on. And now that we have that, or we have this plan, let's give it and make up a reasonable amount of time that you agree on. Let's give this 4 weeks. Let's give this 6 weeks and meet again and see what's happening. Because too often we come up with a plan and then what happens sort of we don't get the follow-up. We don't know. And oops. Are we all seeing the same child? Remember I talked about masking and I talked about being fried by holding it together all day? Well, it might be that the teacher sees a child who looks like he's or she's pretty put together. Well, what do you mean he's anxious? He looks fine. And then you come home and the kid's crying and upset and everything. And it's like we see, it's not that we're seeing the wrong thing or they're seeing the wrong thing. We're seeing different aspects of the same child. And we have to kind of put that together to say, oh, okay, so this is a child when this is what's happening here, this is what's happening here, but it's one person. And so rather than arguing about who's got the right perspective or, well, it must be something at home, right? Because this is happening at home and isn't happening here. Or, we have an understanding that the parent and the teacher and the other people in the school are all legitimately seeing aspects of the same child. How do we understand that? We're back to understanding. How do we understand what is going on here? And maybe if we have one teacher who has the child all day, that teacher has the perspective of the whole day. It may be that the teacher that the child has in the morning sees the child fresh. She's just, if the child's on medication, the child's on, the medication is just kicked in, and the teacher who has last period of the day sees a very different child. And it may not be that the child has a bad attitude to math or a bad attitude toward English. It might just be that one thing is in the morning and the other is in the afternoon, or something is right before lunch when the child is very hungry, and maybe that child needs a snack. to hold them through, because maybe the child didn't eat as much breakfast. So we have to remember, people don't necessarily all see the same thing, and we've got to put that picture together and have it make sense. I had, I've had times when people have said to me that this child has a bad attitude towards something, and it turned out it was the time of day. It turned out it had to do with hunger. And sometimes our kids have trouble with what they call interoception, or understanding the feelings of their bodies and being able to explain them or interpret them. And it kind of takes our insight to help with the understanding that this is kind of what happens when he gets hungry. Okay. And so, or this is what happens when she's like overtired. And by the time she's done all of this, she's overtired. So I just, I also like elephants, but I thought this was a good image for us. I'm trying. It's interesting that something different makes it go forward every time. So it takes a community. That sounds like a former female presidential candidate, but it also is true about working with our children. How many people know your child? Well, you know your child. Maybe there's a therapist involved. Maybe there's an art teacher. Maybe there's a coach. Maybe there's a last year's teacher can be invaluable. Because let's say that 2 years ago, your child had a teacher really, really got her, really got him, really did it. The child just clicked. Okay. Well, what did they do? I went to a school once and had meetings with the school team, and the child had been a very this particular child had a nonverbal learning disability, and they thought that this child was a potential shooter because he was so isolated and wasn't showing affect. And we talked about it, and they understood that the child was simply very literal and didn't know how to join in and didn't have a lot of facial expression. And so I went away and I came back 4 months later, and they had done a phenomenal job. This child was engaged. This child was, doing well in the class, still didn't have a lot of facial affect, but was really, one of the kids sitting at a table, sharing French fries. And I said, I want you guys to write down what you did, not an IEP, not a behavior plan, just simple bullet point list of what worked. When we did this, I did that. And they did. They came up with a one-page bullet point list of the things they had done that worked, and they handed it off to next year's teachers. And next year's teachers hit the ground running. They didn't have to start from scratch. And so teacher from a year or 2 years ago can be an incredible resource. And if that teacher can attend the same meeting, at least maybe they can put something in writing. And again, it doesn't have to be a report. It could just be a list of what that when we would say, do an errand for the class together. And that was a really good bonding time for us. And doing these things helped us establish a trusting relationship. And, whatever it is that teacher had done or that engaged the child, let's use that. Let's learn from that and see if we can have that work again. And this is what I wanted to sort of emphasize again. We talked about anxiety and how so many of these kids end up anxious. They also can end up depressed. If what I got all day was negative feedback, I'd be pretty anxious and depressed too. And some of these kids develop school anxiety or social anxiety or other kinds of anxiety because they anticipate. They don't even have to have negative feedback, they're anticipating it. And so you have one little girl who has been validated. She's been understood, and she's still a lively little kid, but she feels good about herself, and this other little girl doesn't. And kids bear scars of the misunderstanding and the invalidation they've experienced. And no one intends to scar children, but that happens anyway. I wrote a blog about how children on the spectrum are actually scarred by repeated misunderstanding and misintervention. And it had, I think we're up to 267,000 readers, because it struck a chord of people feeling that their kids were not being understood. And so that's why I keep harping on this idea of understanding and this idea of communication. And I'd like to add in the third piece, which is acceptance. Saying, this is who this child is, and what we want is for this child to be able to be authentic, to be who they are, and to find a way of being who they are and navigating this world that works and can be successful, not based on trying to scrunch them into a hole that everybody else fits into, but by being themselves. And that who I am and being me is okay. And here's how I can do it. Here's how I can make it work. So that's is that clear to everybody? Okay, good, because it's such an important point that our kids who are different need to be able to be different, be authentic, and be accepted. And not try to be something they're not, and feel like failures. There was a story about a kid who was ADHD, and he was in school, and they said he would never amount to anything because he wasn't paying attention. He spent as much time being sent out of the classroom as he did in the classroom. And the kid was John Irvine, who actually grew up to be quite successful as a writer. But again, he was getting all that negative feedback when he was in school. So one way to communicate that I think can be helpful is to do that kind of list yourself. And I just made this up. It's a idea, but it's a way of communicating in a very clear, specific way. These are some important things to know about my child. So in this case, I picked a kid named Matt. And the first thing I wanted to get across is what Matt's strengths were and his interests. So he was into robotics, he was into coding, they see the things. So that what I had found out, and I'm sharing what I had found out, I'm not telling people what to do, is that he was really good with hands-on things. He was really good. And when we made a game, or we allowed him to use his creativity to make a game out of what we were doing. And there's so many different ways to learn something. Learning it in his way was really effective for him, and letting him demonstrate what his strengths in how he learned. He also needed motor activity, that skateboarding, not necessarily skateboarding at school, but to use his interests, so that if he had to do it, so often we let a child do a presentation either by making a poster or by making a or doing a report or doing something else. And for Matt here, it might be making a robot that demonstrated what it was we were talking about. But it's telling them these are my kids' interests, and so we can use this, like that little boy who had the photon and electron torpedoes. How can we use his interests to engage him in learning, to engage him in this in the subject matter? Because even if what he is studying, for example, is if he's on a skateboard and the skateboard is going this fast and he's going to do this trick, that's math, right? There's no reason why we can't use that to help engage him in what he's doing. What are some of his sensory triggers? Well, maybe he's overstimulated by loud noises. And in a very loud classroom, what we're going to see is his activity level really go up. And so what we need to think about is the sensory environment. I had a kid who really was overwhelmed by visual complexity. If you gave him a piece of paper and it was just there was too much on it, he became confused. So I think that understanding what a kid's sensory triggers are, and what do we do at home? Well, at home, you can wear noise canceling headphones or, or earbuds or, and some kids work better when they have music in the background as a way of kind of picking up the helping them stay focused. So what works at home? Uh, and what are the social triggers? I have a lot of kids I've seen where they have to have the last word. Anybody ever have that? Where, you can't have, somebody said something, you got to say something back. So you can make it a game. On odd days, you have the last word. On even days, I have the last word. Or, if you can make a sentence with this many, with this many words, then, whoever makes a sentence with this many words, that's the end of it. You can make it a game and very easily embarrassed. Okay. And if we understand that, then we can help diffuse that. If we understand that's what's going on, maybe our child, this particular child gets very antsy, but really it's embarrassment. And so how do we help the teacher understand that's what's happening with this child, like that boy who was so hard on himself? Does the child have learning issues? Well, if you're having issues with paying attention or you're having trouble with auditory processing, having a lot of verbal stuff coming at you can be a real challenge. And so how do we help that child? Well, what do we do at home? Well, at home I have a chart, right? And the chart's in the kitchen. And it's right there in front of all of us as to what it is we're doing, right? And so you come downstairs and you see, this is what we're doing, or this is what today is, and so it might be that using a chart or a whiteboard can be really helpful. Or we think of manipulatives as something that we use with kids who are very young, but I've had high school students who learned fractions in math and in algebra using manipulatives. So sometimes a hands-on job needs to do that, using visuals, having things written down. Of course, we all know there's all kinds of ways, but we need again to be able to say, this is what's going on with my kid, and this is what's worked in the past, or this is what we do at home. I and I realize none of these are incredibly original ideas, but it's just saying this is what's worked. And emotional issues, a child who gets frustrated easily. We need to know that it may not be obvious that this child is frustrated because this child actually has very high standards and very high expectations of what she's supposed to be able to do. And so she's frustrated because she feels she should be getting it right the first time, or she feels that I'm good at this and I should be able to do this. And so how do we help that child? Maybe we help anticipate frustration. Maybe we help anticipate. We've been through this enough times to know that this is often a frustrating experience. Maybe we need to help. Maybe the child isn't even aware of what it is that was so frustrating, or that they're getting so frustrated, and we have to help them recognize what's going on with themselves. I had one child who would be getting frustrated, and the teachers had learned by looking what were the signals that he was getting frustrated. And he would get frustrated in gym if people were bumping into him. Okay, that was something that annoyed him. And the teacher used a green, yellow, red code system. And so if he thought the kid was getting annoyed, he'd say, hey, Alan, are you yellow? And if Alan would say, yeah, that meant he could go over to the side and take a break. All right, so we can have ways of helping the child deal with emotional regulation. If we may have to help them recognize what are the signs that I'm getting dysregulated. And as I said, getting very down on themselves. A lot of times we think that children don't have expectations, but they do have expectations of themselves. They have a sense of pride. They have a sense of I'm bright. I want to do this. I want to be good at this. And it can be, you can get really down on yourself if you think you should be good at something or you want to be good at something and you're struggling with it anyway. So again, understanding that, helping them talk through it, helping validate is really important.
Marcia, excuse me, I just want to give you a reminder, it's 9 o'clock.
Okay, and we don't have too much further to go, which is good. So what we need is out of the box thinking. We need to come up with ways of doing all this that are not necessarily just what's prescribed. And we need to do that follow-up I talked about. We want to identify exactly what are we looking for if we're going to be talking about progress. And we're not talking about 3 times out of 5, he's going to be able to do X, Y, and Z. We're talking about a very pragmatic, how the child's going to be feeling and acting. And each time we come up with ideas, we're going to schedule the next time we look at them and decide who needs to be here, because that's so important to have that kind of follow-up. And also, how do we follow up between meetings? You're a parent, you're seeing something, another meeting's not scheduled for several weeks. Who do you contact? How do you contact? What modality? How often should you be contacting? How will a teacher contact you? Is there a once a week email or a text, or how are we going to do this? If there's an understanding, then we kind of know how to go about what we're doing. We can also know whether it's working. If their kid has a lot of teachers, is there one person who's the kind of, I think of it as by basketball, so I think of a point guard, but the person who's the manager, the person who's the person you go to who then communicates to other people, so we have to have a system that we try out and we find how it works. And don't leave out the child, okay? The child has to play a role in all of this. It's understanding, it means understanding the child's perspective, and understanding what's working means understanding the child's perspective too. The child has to be part of the problem solving. And everybody needs validation. Guess what, parents? We need validation. We need to make acknowledged that we're doing as a good job and we're doing the best we can. The teacher needs validation too, and the kid needs validation. So all of us need validation that we're really doing our parts and we're really working hard. So in summary, you see, I told you it was close to the end. Understanding takes time, it takes effort, it takes communicating with everybody. It takes including the child, especially the child, finding out from the child and when you get to be teenage, it might be someone other than the parent the child will talk to more openly. It might be the coach, it might be someone else. And acceptance is critical to trust. We have to accept the child for who he, she, they are, for their authentic selves, not for trying to be someone they're not, and encourage them that tell us, you don't have to hide it. If you're anxious, tell us and let us help you so that you're not getting so much anxiety. What is it that's going on? And we're going to communicate understanding so the child is engaged and not shamed during the day. And we want everyone to feel they've been heard. That's the teacher being heard, that's the parent being heard, that's the child being heard. It's important, if we're going to be a functioning team, that everybody feels heard and listened to. And follow-up is sharing, not blaming. So if we try something and it doesn't work, there's no finger pointing. It's, look, we all came up with a great idea. Now let's come up with another one. So that's pretty much it. So let's open this up for ideas, questions, talking to each other.
So can you hear me?
Mhm.
Yeah, we can, yes.
So Jayada wrote in the chat, what do you do when the IEP chair and others tell you that your child is making progress based on their understanding of assessments, but as the parent, you can see that your child is not making improvements in, for example, reading or writing?
Well, I think that, I think that's something that happens a lot. And I think that again, what we bring it in as a concern that what we're seeing, what are we seeing that makes us think that there isn't that kind of progress? Are we seeing what what we see in homework at home? Are we seeing what the child's going through? What, and to be able to share with them because they're using certain assessment measures. We might say, you know what, we're not measuring the 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 thing that we really need to measure, because sometimes that can be the case. You have a test, you give the test, the kid's doing well, the kid's doing better. But in fact, we know that the kid is struggling or that the kid isn't getting it. So maybe we have to have different measures of what we're looking at for progress.
Thank you so much. This was a wonderful presentation and definitely very affirming.
Oh,
you.
thank you.
Marcia, I just wanted to say thank you for reminding us that school is really hard for our kids. My son, actually, he's in college now, and although he's made great progress, he called me today and discussing some of his challenges and how hard school still is for him. And he's probably fine right now, and I'm eating my guts out. But the truth is that school is not the real world. And I think we talk a lot, he and I, about showing up as your true self when you're going to these parties and you're trying to do what everybody else is doing, but that's not really who you are, and you don't want to be somebody other than yourself. So it was a great reminder, and you personally made me feel better. So thank you.
Oh, good. And I mean, our kids can find things to do as they get out of school that are just so much of a better fit, you know?
And that figuring out piece, I would just be curious. Any suggestions about figuring out like which roads? I know career counselors and things like that, but anything specific that you can think of for ADDers?
Well, I think it's where I know I sound like a broken record when I keep talking about understanding, but also understanding the child's strengths and the child and their strengths and interests.
Yeah, of course.
Uh, And so if in any given area, there are so many different kinds of jobs that people do that are in that area. Sports, there are people who are involved with teams, there are people who are involved in journalism, there are people who are involved, not everybody has to be a major league player to be involved in sports. Or I think half the writers of half the shows are all on ADHD. They kind of have to be that creative. There, I have one young woman that I've just been evaluating, and she's real sensory issues and really, needs to kind of be doing her own thing, very artistic. And she's going to school to be a master gardener and a landscape designer, which is an interesting way of making a living at art and design, and also being able to control her environment and be outside. So remember that box? It's thinking outside the box.
Right.
Oh, there's Andrea, and I don't know if you have anything else to add, but Karen Leahy has a question, and I'll read it. How do we have the child study team adopt this kind of an attitude? Because I guess the one Karen's dealing with, because they seem to definitely go into this with an oppositional attitude.
Well, I think that what works with the kids is validating and accepting and listening and then introducing. It's that whole Ross Green collaborative problem solving. Maybe what we have to do with them is listen and say, no, let me make sure I have your ideas. Okay, so you think this, and this? I really get that. And that really makes sense. On the other hand, so sort of do a raw screen approach in terms of, they're coming in thinking, I think they're coming in feeling like they have to be adversarial, to be the professional and to take control. Do you know what I mean? And it reminds me of that thing about martial arts where a small person could throw a larger person because they use their energy. So that if someone big is coming at you, you don't go like this, you go with their energy. So they're coming at you, go with their energy. Say, wow, those are really interesting ideas. I'm really glad you brought that up. And let's think about it some more together. We'd really like to, you know what I mean? Instead of coming at them with, no, you guys are wrong, you're not making sense. And so, you using a little kind of karate savvy.
So I don't know, Karen, if this is the issue, but and if this was helpful, but I know a lot of school districts don't want to spend the money to, have an OT come in or give the kids speech and language therapy or, have an aide in the classroom. And so as a parent, you sort of know what the kid needs. Maybe you had a neuropsych done, so you've, got all these recommendations, and then you have the school saying, well, we can't do that, or he doesn't, I've been in schools where they've said, oh, he doesn't need speech and language therapy. No, he didn't have a list, but the kid had some language-based learning issues. So Karen, is that what you're talking about? I think as I was talking, Karen said true. Yes. So, which kind of ends up leaving us in quite a dilemma. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Well, it is quite a dilemma. I think that unfortunately, we are not giving the resources to schools that they need to be able to do everything that they're tasked with doing. And, it's understandable that they might feel defensive about that. But, so the question is it possible, for example, to train somebody who's maybe isn't this isn't their role, but to be able to be helpful in a particular way? I know of a parent where that was something that turned out to be quite helpful. That are there ways that kids can that we can help kids work together? We really do have to get out of the box of thinking that, well, it can only be done this way. Well, if you only have one person who's the speech and language person and she's, only has X number of hours, then, how do we handle this? Well, again, there are a number of people who can work under her with her supervision and be practicing something with the child. And so I think that it is very hard. And I can't tell you how often I've heard the words, yes, they're supposed to have a free and appropriate education, but you want a Cadillac and all I owe them is a Chevrolet. So anybody else ever heard that one?
That's awful.
Yeah. And, I think trying to find creative ways to not just battle for a piece of the same pie, but to kind of redefine what the pie is, so that there can be more help. And I think again, perhaps engaging the child around the child's strengths will give a child a chance to practice and learn something in a way that's engaging to him, instead of defining him in terms of his deficits and then, making him practice it that way. that might be, different approach to having a child learning something that would work better, and let the child be doing it either more independently or more, as opposed to simply having someone drill on this with a special ed deficit orientation. Does that make any sense?
Karen, does it make sense? Makes sense to me. You know, I mean, maybe this is not the time for this conversation, but underlying all this has to come our understanding as parents of what our child's strengths and weaknesses are. And some of that is, like, does anybody really understand NLVD, no, NVLD, sorry, nonverbal learning disorder, or, sensory issues, or, what a language-based learning disability is, or what working memory issues are. What I find sometimes parents find helpful is if they can have the psychologist or whoever does the testing to put it into English. Okay, so what does this look like in the classroom? The kid has difficulty with on this test or that test, or there's this discrepancy or that discrepancy. Okay, so here's what you're going to see in the classroom. And maybe educating teachers once parents are educated so that they're really describing their kid and the strengths and the weaknesses.
Yeah, I think that is an incredibly important point, because I think too often all of these things are put theoretically and not pragmatically. Not how do you, yes, that my child has this issue, but what do you see in the classroom? What does this look like? I had a school with a kid who had that nonverbal learning disability, and he had trouble with transitions, and he had slow motor speed. He had trouble with buttoning and things like that. And he was coming from gym. His next class was math. And so he had difficulty coming in from gym and getting changed. And then he had to do the whole thing, and he got to math late. And the teacher thought he was disrespectful, and he was, had an attitude about math and all this sort of thing. And we had to say, hey, when we say somebody has trouble transitioning, this is what it looks like. It takes more time. Or when we say somebody has sensory issues, how often does anyone ever stop and listen and think and feel, what is the sensory environment here right now? Do you know what I mean? So it's theoretical, oh, sensory issues, that's on the sheet. But how often do we really stop and think, what is the sensory environment in this cafeteria? Could that have something to do with how the child is behaving? So you're absolutely right. We have to put it into pragmatic English and into how do we see all this? How do these problems come out in a classroom, and how do we help them understanding what it is that we're dealing with?
Yes. And I'm looking at the time. So I think it feels like we could just keep talking and keep talking. But we're going to have to stop because I want to respect people's time. I want to mention a couple of things. One, if anyone has any kids who have a teacher who might be willing to learn, who might be open, we invite teachers to come to our monthly teacher talks. And we are more than happy to have a conversation with teachers and to discuss what their concerns are and their issues are, as well as to support them and maybe help them see things from a broader perspective. Also, I want to mention the CHAD conference is November 11th. Well, no, it's the 14th, 15th, 16th in November. Today is the last day to get the discount. So if you're interested in coming, it's in LA. Many of us will be there from Bergen CHAD. Some of us will be presenting. But if you don't make the discount for tonight, try to come anyway. If you're a member of CHAD, there is a discount for CHAD members. So I wanted to mention that. And Marcia, let's keep talking. I love this. This was just, this is great. Folks, this is how to get in touch with Marcia. If you have any questions, she's very accessible, although I know she's busy with a lot of things right now. But she's a wonderful fund of information. And I thank you all for coming, and we hope to see you again. So
Thanks
have a great
for having me.
Oh, our pleasure, really.
Thank you.